The night Claire Bennett knocked on my door at 1 a.m. in her husband's old work coat, I had no idea I was about to spend the next 9 months rebuilding a life that wasn't mine to rebuild. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 36. I run a small engine repair shop out of my garage on the edge of town, the kind of place where farmers bring in mowers and chainsaws and the occasional truck that 3 other shops already gave up on. I live alone in the house I grew up in, on a gravel road with exactly 4 houses on it, and for the last 2 years, one of those houses had belonged to Tom and Claire Bennett. Tom died on a Tuesday in March. Sudden, no warning, the kind of death that leaves a house too quiet too fast. I went to the funeral because that's what you do out here. I brought a casserole because that's what you do out here, too. I shook Claire's hand at the door of the funeral home and said the useless sentence everybody says, "Let me know if you need anything," and then, like everybody else, I went back to my own life and mostly left her alone with hers, because grief isn't a thing you crash into uninvited. For 8 months after that, our only real contact was a wave across the fence line and the sound of her car pulling in late some nights when she'd clearly been sitting in a parking lot somewhere just to avoid coming home to an empty house. I noticed things I didn't mean to notice. The porch light that stayed on till morning. The mailbox that leaned a little more every month because nobody straightened the post. The grass that grew shaggy in June because Tom used to be the one who mowed it, and Claire had never once touched that machine in her life. I almost said something a dozen times. I never did. It felt like the kind of offer that could look like something it wasn't, and I didn't want to be the man circling a grieving widow's yard with a lawnmower and bad intentions written all over him, even if my intentions were nothing but neighborly. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast on a November night, the kind of storm the weather radio calls isolated severe right before it isn't isolated at all. Wind came sideways. A transformer blew 2 streets over and the whole gravel road went dark at the same time, one long snap and then nothing but the storm talking to itself outside my windows. I lit 2 candles, put a pot of coffee on the stove burner since the electric one was dead, and figured I'd ride it out same as always. Around 1 in the morning, somebody started knocking on my door. Fast, urgent knocking, not polite at all. I opened it and there was Claire, soaked through despite the porch overhang, wearing Tom's old canvas work coat because it was the first thing she'd grabbed, her hair plastered to her face, a flashlight shaking in one hand. "Nathan," she said, and her voice had that thin, stretched sound people get when they've been alone with their fear for too long. "I'm sorry. I know it's late. What's wrong?" "There's a tree down across my driveway and I can hear something, I don't know, banging against the side of the house. I called the power company, I called my brother-in-law, nobody's answering, and she stopped and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth like she was trying to hold something in. I didn't want to be alone in there tonight. I grabbed my own flashlight off the hook by the door and walked her back to check the house first, because that felt like the responsible thing before anything else. Turned out a loose gutter section had torn free and was slapping against her siding every time the wind gusted, which explained the banging, and a birch tree had come down across the end of her driveway, which explained why she hadn't just driven to a hotel in town like a sensible person might have. "It's not going to hurt anything tonight," I told her, once I'd checked the gutter wasn't about to peel the whole roofline off. "Storm'll blow through by 4. "I know that logically," she said. "I just couldn't make myself believe it standing in that house by myself." I looked at her standing there in Tom's coat, shivering, and I made a decision that felt small at the time and turned out to be the biggest one of my year. "Come sit at my place till it passes," I said. "I've got coffee and a couch and neither one of us needs to be brave about a birch tree tonight." She looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether accepting that was a betrayal of something, and then she nodded, quick, like she needed to do it before she talked herself out of it. We sat in my kitchen with candles burning low and the storm hammering the windows, and for the first hour neither of us said much beyond the weather and the coffee. Around 2:30, she finally set her mug down and said, "Can I ask you something strange?" "Sure." "Would you mind if I just stayed here tonight?" "Not," she stopped, embarrassed, "not like that. I mean on the couch. I just don't think I can walk back into that dark house right now, tree or no tree." "Claire, you don't have to explain it. Stay. I'll get you a blanket." That was all it was supposed to be. One night. A blanket, a couch, a storm that blew itself out by morning same as I said it would. I made breakfast because it seemed rude not to, and she ate it standing at my counter, still a little pale, still wearing Tom's coat over her shoulders like armor, and she thanked me 3 separate times before she finally walked back down the road to her own house once the sun came up and a neighbor's boy had already dragged the birch tree clear with his truck and a chain. I figured that was the end of it. A kind thing that happened once, the kind of story we'd both tell at church potlucks for a year or two. Remember that storm, when Nathan let me sleep on his couch? I did not expect it to be the first thread in something that would take 9 months to fully unravel and rebuild. The second time she knocked on my door, it wasn't a storm. It was 3 weeks later, and it was a different kind of trouble entirely. I was in the garage finishing up a lawnmower carburetor when her car pulled into my driveway too fast, gravel spraying under the tires. She got out already talking before her door was fully open. "Derek's trying to sell the house," she said. I set my wrench down. Tom's brother. Tom's brother. He came by this afternoon with some real estate agent I've never met in my life and started walking through my house measuring rooms like he already owned them. Her hands were shaking, and not from cold this time. He says the will names him executor of the estate until probate closes, and technically that gives him authority over decisions about the property while things are in process, and he's decided the responsible thing is to sell before winter, quote, before the market cools off. Is that true? About the executor part? I don't know. I don't know anything about wills or probate or any of it. Tom handled the paperwork side of everything. I handled the garden and the school fundraisers. Her voice cracked on the word garden, and I understood then that this wasn't really about Derek or the house. It was about a woman who'd spent 15 years trusting one man to carry the parts of life she never had to touch, and now that man was gone, and everybody around her, including his own brother, seemed to think that made her a problem to be managed instead of a person to be asked. I didn't know real estate law any better than she did, but I knew where to find somebody who did. There's a lawyer in town, Marsh, does estate stuff. Went to school with my cousin. Let's go see him tomorrow morning, first thing, before Derek gets any further along with whatever he's planning. Claire looked at me like I'd offered her a rope in deep water. You don't have to get involved in this. I'm not getting involved in anything. I'm giving you a ride to a lawyer's office. That's it. That's what I told myself, anyway. It was a lie by the second sentence, but it was the kind of lie a person needs sometimes to do the right thing without overthinking it into something complicated. Marsh's office was small, above the hardware store, with a window unit that rattled louder than it cooled. He read through the papers Claire brought, took his glasses off, rubbed his eyes, and told her plainly that Derek was, at best, badly misinformed, and at worst, hoping she wouldn't know enough to push back. You're the sole beneficiary named in this will, Marsh said. Derek's listed as executor, yes, which means he handles the administrative side, filing paperwork, paying outstanding debts from the estate. It does not give him authority to sell property that's being left to you. He can't list this house without your signature. Full stop. Claire sat very still for a moment, processing that. Then she said, quiet, so he was just hoping I wouldn't know that. I'd say that's likely, Marsh said, not unkindly. Driving back, Claire stared out the window for a long stretch of the county road before she finally spoke. 15 years married to Tom, and I never once had to know what an executor was. Now I'm supposed to just understand all of it overnight, or people like Derek get to walk through my house with real estate agents. You don't have to understand all of it overnight, I said. You just have to understand enough to know when someone's trying to walk past you instead of through you. She looked over at me then, something shifting in her face. Where'd you learn to talk like that? Watching a lot of guys try to walk past my mother after my dad passed. She got real good at spotting it after the third one tried. Claire almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I'd seen from her since the funeral, and something about it settled into my chest and stayed there longer than it should have for a neighbor giving another neighbor a ride to a lawyer's office. Derek didn't take the news well. He showed up at Claire's place 2 days later, driving a truck that looked freshly detailed, wearing a jacket that looked freshly pressed, the kind of man who dressed for a fight he expected to win without breaking a sweat. I happened to be in her yard fixing the gutter that had come loose in the storm, and I stayed where I was instead of walking over, because some fights a woman needs to have standing on her own porch, not flanked by a neighbor holding a caulk gun. You got a lawyer, Derek said, loud enough to carry across the yard. That's cute. I got information, Claire said. There's a difference. You think this is easy for me? Managing Tom's estate, handling all this on top of everything else, and you're out here treating me like the enemy. I'm not treating you like anything, Derek. I'm just not signing papers I don't understand because you're in a hurry. He glanced my direction then, and I felt the shift in his attention before he even said anything, that particular look men give another man when they're deciding whether to be embarrassed or aggressive about being caught. And him, Derek said. Neighbor's awful invested in family business that isn't his. Claire's spine straightened in a way I hadn't seen from her before that moment. Nathan drove me to a lawyer's office because I asked him to. That's the whole story, and even if it wasn't, it still wouldn't be yours to comment on. Derek's jaw worked for a second. Then he said, quieter, meaner, Tom's not even cold, Claire. That landed the way he meant it to. I saw it hit her, saw her flinch like she'd been struck, and it took everything in me to stay planted by the gutter instead of crossing the yard. But Claire didn't back down. Her voice shook, but it didn't stop. Tom would be ashamed of how you've talked to me since the funeral. Measuring my house for buyers before the flowers on his grave finished wilting. Don't you dare stand in my yard and lecture me about respect. Derek didn't have an answer for that. He got back in his freshly detailed truck and left, gravel kicking up behind the tires same as Claire's had 3 weeks earlier, and once his taillights disappeared down the road, Claire sat down hard on her porch steps and put her face in her hands. I walked over that time. Sat down next to her, not too close, just close enough. I hate this, she said into her palms. I hate that I have to fight for a house I already own just because I'm the one who's left. You didn't lose that fight. I know. It still doesn't feel like winning. She lifted her head and looked at me, eyes red but dry. Why are you doing all this, Nathan? Really? I thought about giving her the easy answer, the neighborly answer, the one that kept things simple and safe for both of us. Instead I gave her something closer to the truth, though not all of it, not yet. Because 8 months ago I watched your porch light stay on all night more times than I want to count, and I never once said anything, and that's been sitting wrong with me since. I'm not going to let a man in a pressed jacket walk over you just because I was too polite to get involved before. Claire didn't say anything to that. She just reached over and squeezed my hand once, quick, before letting go, and something about that small gesture told me more than words would have. Over the next 2 months, a rhythm built itself between us without either of us really deciding it should. I started mowing her lawn on the same Saturday I mowed my own, because it felt stupid to run 2 separate trips to the gas station for the same can. She started leaving a plate of something on my porch most Sunday evenings, because she said cooking for 1 felt like a punishment and cooking for 2 felt like a Sunday. We fixed the mailbox post together on a cold afternoon in January, her holding it steady while I poured quickset concrete around the base, both of us complaining about the wind the entire time and neither one of us actually wanting to go inside where it was warm. Derek didn't disappear. He tried twice more, once with a different real estate agent who claimed to have a buyer already lined up sight unseen, and once with a letter from a lawyer of his own that Marsh looked at for 4 minutes before calling it, in his words, aggressive nonsense with no legal teeth. Each time, Claire got a little steadier in how she handled it. By February, she wasn't calling me in a panic anymore. She was calling to tell me what Derek had tried and how she'd already shut it down, and there was something in her voice during those calls that sounded less like fear and more like a woman finding her footing on ground that used to feel like it was tilting under her. Small towns notice everything eventually, and ours was no exception. By late February, the woman who ran the diner on Main Street, a sharp-eyed lady named Ruthie who'd been serving coffee to half the county since before I was born, started giving me a particular look every time I came in for lunch alone. "You're at the Bennett place an awful lot for a man who's supposedly just fixing gutters," she said one afternoon, setting my plate down harder than necessary. "I like being neighborly, Ruthie." Aha. She wiped her hands on her apron and gave me a look that had probably talked half the town into confessing things over the years. "Tom Bennett was a good man. I'm not saying otherwise about you being over there. I'm just saying people talk, and Claire's got enough on her plate without folks whispering behind her back at the grocery store." I didn't have a good answer for that at the time, because the truth was still forming itself, still somewhere between neighborly and something neither of us had named out loud yet. I just told Ruthie that Claire was a grown woman who could handle her own business, and Ruthie snorted like she'd heard that line from 100 men who ended up eating those words eventually. She wasn't wrong to notice, and she wasn't the only one. Claire mentioned once that the church ladies had started including little pointed comments in their casserole drop-offs, the kind of comments dressed up as concern that were really just curiosity wearing a nicer coat. "You're looking well, dear. Nathan's been such a help, hasn't he? Must be nice having somebody so dependable around." Claire always smiled through it and said thank you and never gave them anything more to chew on than that, but I could tell some days it wore on her, being watched that closely while she was still trying to figure out what she was even building. "I hate that everybody thinks they get an opinion on how fast I'm supposed to grieve," she told me one evening in March, sitting on my porch steps with a mug of tea going cold in her hands. "Like there's a schedule. 6 months, you're allowed to smile again. 8 months, you're allowed to have a friend. A year, maybe, if you're lucky, somebody decides you've suffered enough to be allowed to feel something new." "There isn't a schedule," I said. "Anybody who thinks there is has never actually lost anybody, or they've forgotten what it felt like fast. I know that up here." She tapped her temple. "Doesn't stop it from getting under my skin sometimes." I didn't have a fix for that, not really. All I could offer was staying steady beside her while the town worked through its own opinions on its own schedule, which, as it turned out, was the only thing that mattered in the end. People talk. People also eventually stop talking once they see something isn't going anywhere except forward, honest and unhidden. By summer, most of the whispering had quieted into simple acceptance, the kind small towns eventually settle into once they realize a thing isn't a scandal, just a story still being written. Somewhere in there, without either of us announcing it, the visit stopped being about gutters and lawyers and started being about nothing at all. She'd come over just to sit on my porch while I worked in the garage. I'd walk down to her place just to eat dinner and stay for the dishes. We didn't talk about what it was. We just kept showing up, and the showing up said more than either of us was ready to. The thing that changed everything happened in April, 5 months after that first storm. Claire came over one evening with a box under her arm, the kind of cardboard box that had clearly been sitting in a closet since March of the year before, untouched. She set it on my kitchen table and just stood there looking at it. "I found this cleaning out the hall closet," she said. "It's Tom's things. His watch, some letters, that kind of thing. I haven't been able to go through it. I keep starting and then I just close the lid again. You don't have to go through it tonight." "I know. I think I want to, though. And I think I want you here when I do." She looked up at me. "Is that strange? Asking my neighbor to sit with me while I go through my dead husband's things. I don't think we've been just neighbors in a while, Claire." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to relief, like she'd been waiting for somebody to say that plainly instead of letting it sit unspoken between casseroles and mowed lawns. "No," she said. "I don't think we have." We went through the box together at my kitchen table. His old watch, stopped at some hour that didn't matter anymore. A stack of letters from when they were young and he was working a summer out of state, the handwriting careful in a way people don't write anymore. And near the bottom, folded twice, a letter addressed simply to Claire, in handwriting that was shakier than the old letters, written sometime closer to the end. She read it silent, hand pressed to her mouth, and then she pushed it across the table to me without a word, which felt like its own kind of trust. It wasn't long. Tom had written it not long before he died, apparently just in case, the way some people quietly do without telling anybody. Most of it was for her alone, and I won't pretend I remember every line, but near the end, he'd written something that stuck with me the way certain sentences do. He told her that grief was allowed to have a shelf life, that loving him again in memory didn't mean loving somebody else in the present was a betrayal, and that if she ever found a good man willing to stand next to her without asking her to be smaller, she should let herself have that, because he'd rather she be happy standing beside someone steady than lonely standing beside his memory. Claire cried for a long time after that, not the sharp grief of the funeral, something slower and gentler, the kind of crying that clears something out instead of hollowing it further. I didn't say much. I just stayed at the table with her, my hand over hers, until the crying eased into something quieter. "I think I've been waiting for permission," she finally said. "Not from you. Not even really from myself. I think some part of me has been waiting for Tom to tell me it was allowed. And now he has. Now he has." She looked up at me, eyes still wet but clearer than I'd seen them in the 8 months I'd known her as a widow instead of a stranger's wife. "Nathan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer isn't what I'm hoping for." Go ahead. Is this real? What's been happening between us these past few months? Or have I just been leaning on the nearest steady thing because I was scared to be alone? I thought about that question seriously, because she deserved a serious answer, not a quick reassurance meant to make both of us feel better in the moment. I've asked myself the same thing, I said. And I don't think leaning on somebody because you're scared and caring about somebody for real have to cancel each other out. I think you can start in one place and end up somewhere true. I know I didn't start mowing your lawn because I was falling for you. I started because it was the decent thing to do. But somewhere between the gutter and the lawyer's office and the mailbox post, decent turned into something I look forward to every single day. That's not leaning, Claire. That's just what happened. She didn't answer with words. She reached across the table and kissed me, careful at first, like she was testing whether the ground beneath that decision would hold, and when it did, when neither of us pulled back, something settled between us that had been circling for months finally landed. We didn't rush anything after that. Both of us had reasons to be careful, her because a small town has a long memory and an even longer set of assumptions about a widow moving quickly, me because I didn't want to be the reason anyone whispered about her at church. So we kept it quiet for a while, not secret exactly, just unannounced, the kind of thing a small town figures out on its own eventually whether you announce it or not. My cousin Beth, the one who'd gone to school with Marsh the lawyer, caught wind of it faster than most, mostly because she has a habit of seeing everything from her kitchen window that faces the road. She called me one evening in May, not to gossip exactly, more to check that I knew what I was doing. "You're serious about Claire Bennett," she said, not really asking. "I am. Nathan, I'm not going to lecture you. I just want to know you've thought it through. She's still got a headstone with her married name carved into it not 2 miles from here. That's not a small thing to walk into." "I know what I'm walking into, Beth. I've been walking into it slowly for 6 months. It's not some impulsive thing I decided over a weekend." There was a pause on the line, and then Beth's voice softened. "Okay. I believe you. I just had to ask, because I remember how quiet you got after Dad died, how long it took you to let anybody help you with anything. I wanted to make sure somebody was being careful with her the way people were careful with you back then. That stuck with me more than I expected it to. I hadn't thought about my own grief in those terms in years, the slow, private work of learning to let people back in after loss carves a hole through the middle of your life. Talking to Beth that evening reminded me that what Claire and I were building wasn't just about 2 people who happened to live on the same gravel road. It was about 2 people who understood, in a way most folks our age hadn't had reason to learn yet, exactly how much care a thing like this required, and exactly why it was worth taking that care instead of rushing past it. I told Claire about the call later that week, sitting on her back steps while she deadheaded the roses Tom had planted years earlier, the ones she'd kept alive out of stubbornness more than sentiment, she said, though I suspected it was a little of both. "Beth's not wrong to worry," Claire said, snipping a spent bloom and dropping it into the bucket beside her. "I worry too, some nights. Not about you. About whether I'm doing this the right way, whether there even is a right way, whether Tom would look at all this and understand, or whether some part of him would be hurt by how quickly his side of the closet emptied out to make room for somebody else's shirts. What do you think he'd say, if you had to guess?" She was quiet for a moment, working another dead bloom loose with careful fingers. "I think he'd tell me not to waste a good thing worrying about whether I deserved it. He was like that. Practical to the bone. He probably would have told me to stop crying and go fix the gutter myself if I hadn't found somebody willing to do it for me." That got a real laugh out of both of us, the kind of laugh that comes easier the further you get from the sharpest edge of grief, and for a while we just sat there in the last of the evening light, not needing to fill the silence with anything else. Derek figured it out in June, and he did not take it quietly. He showed up at Claire's place on a Saturday morning while I was there fixing a fence post, which by that point wasn't an unusual sight at all, and something about seeing my truck parked in her driveway on a weekend morning apparently told him everything he'd been suspecting for months. "Unbelievable," he said, getting out of his truck before it had fully stopped rolling. "Not even a year, Claire. Not even a full year, and you've already replaced him." "Nobody's replacing anybody," Claire said, standing her ground on the porch steps the same way she had that first time back in December. "Sure looks like it from where I'm standing. Handyman shows up to fix your gutter and now he's got his truck in your driveway every weekend. What's next? Wedding bells before Tom's even had a proper anniversary." I set down the post-hole digger and walked over, because this time I wasn't staying by the fence line pretending it wasn't my business. It was my business now, whether Derek liked it or not. You want to talk to somebody about this? Talk to me, I said. Derek's eyes cut to me, sharp. This isn't your family, Cole. No, but it's my life, same as it's hers. And you don't get to walk into her yard and shame her for finding something good just because it makes your version of grief feel more comfortable. My version of grief. Derek's voice climbed. He was my brother. He was, Claire said, stepping down off the porch to stand beside me instead of behind me. And I loved him for 15 years, Derek. That love doesn't get erased because I found room in my life for something new. Tom wrote me a letter before he died telling me exactly that he wanted me to be happy, not frozen. I have that letter in a drawer inside if you'd like to read it, because apparently you think you understood what your brother wanted better than his own handwriting does. That stopped Derek cold. He stood there for a long moment, the anger draining out of his face into something closer to confusion, maybe even a little shame. He wrote that? Derek asked, quieter. He did. And I think part of why you fought me so hard on the house and the will and everything else isn't really about money or property, Derek. I think it's about not wanting to accept that your brother's gone, and me moving forward makes that harder to avoid. But that's grief you need to work through, not a fight you get to keep having with me. Derek didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the ground, then at his truck, then finally at Claire with something that almost looked like an apology forming and not quite making it all the way out. I'll leave the house stuff alone, he said finally. The paperwork clears next month anyway. There's nothing left to fight about. There wasn't ever anything to fight about, Claire said. You just needed somewhere to put it. He left without another word, and this time the gravel didn't spray behind his tires. He drove out slow, like a man thinking hard about something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. That was the last real confrontation. Derek didn't become a friend overnight, small towns don't heal that fast and neither do brothers grieving brothers, but the fighting stopped, and by August he'd sent Claire a short, awkward text wishing her well, which for a man like Derek was close enough to peace as either of us expected to get. The 9-month mark landed on a Thursday in late August, though neither of us had been counting on purpose. We were sitting on my porch after dinner, the same porch where she'd first drunk coffee in Tom's soaked work coat back in November, and Claire brought it up herself. Do you realize it's been 9 months since that storm? She said. I hadn't done the math. I did. This afternoon, actually. 9 months since I knocked on your door at 1 in the morning because I was too scared to be alone in my own house. She was quiet for a second, looking out at the yard where the mailbox post still stood straight, where the gutter hadn't come loose again, where the grass stayed mowed on schedule now without anybody having to ask. I keep thinking about how different everything is now. 9 months ago I couldn't sit in my own kitchen without feeling like the walls were watching me wait for Tom to come home. Now I feel like I have a life again. A whole one, not a half one waiting to be filled back in. That's not nothing, I said. No. It's everything, actually. She turned to look at me, and there was something steady in her face, something that hadn't been there back in November, something that had been built slowly across 100 small ordinary evenings instead of arriving all at once. Nathan, I've been thinking about something for a few weeks now, and I want to just say it plainly instead of dancing around it. Go ahead. I don't want to keep living in 2 separate houses pretending this is casual. I know a small town is going to talk regardless of what we do, so we might as well give them something worth talking about. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and for a second I thought it might be another letter from Tom, another piece of that box she'd finally finished going through weeks earlier. It wasn't. It was a listing printout, a small parcel of land at the corner where our 2 properties met, land that belonged to neither of us but had been sitting unclaimed and unused for years. I talked to the county about it, she said. It's available. If we bought it together and built something new there, right at the line between your place and mine, it wouldn't be your house or my house anymore. It would just be ours, built from nothing, no ghosts standing in the doorways, no grief waiting in the closets. A place that starts clean, for both of us. I looked at that piece of paper for a long moment, and then I looked at her, at the woman who'd knocked on my door soaked and scared 9 months earlier and had somehow, slowly, turned into the person I looked forward to seeing every single day without ever quite noticing the exact moment that shift happened. That's not a small thing you're asking, I said. I know. I'm not asking small anymore, Nathan. I spent 8 months after Tom died trying to make myself small enough that grief wouldn't notice I was still standing there. I'm done with small. She took a breath. I love you. I didn't expect to. I definitely didn't expect it 9 months after burying my husband, and if that makes people in this town whisper, let them whisper. I know what's true, and what's true is that you never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I was, scared or steady, breaking down or standing tall, and I want to build something with you that's ours from the ground up. I didn't need 9 months to know my own answer. I'd known it for a while, if I was honest, somewhere around the mailbox post in January, or maybe even earlier, somewhere in that first quiet breakfast after the storm when she thanked me 3 times for something that had already stopped feeling like a favor and started feeling like the beginning of something neither of us had planned for. I love you too, I said. And yeah. Let's build something new. We broke ground on that corner lot the following spring, almost exactly a year and a half after that November storm first knocked on my door in the shape of a scared, soaked woman in her dead husband's coat. Derek came to the small gathering we had once the foundation was poured, stood a little apart from everybody else, but he came, and when he shook my hand before he left, he held onto it a second longer than a handshake usually lasts and said, quiet enough that only I heard it, take care of her. He'd have wanted that. I told him I would. I meant it the way you mean the promises that actually matter, the kind you don't have to think twice about keeping. Claire and I got married that fall in the yard between our 2 old houses, the ones that would sit empty of us soon enough once the new place was finished, surrounded by neighbors who'd watch the whole slow story unfold across mowed lawns and mailbox repairs and Sunday dinners left on porches, none of them surprised by the ending because they'd all quietly watched the middle happen one ordinary evening at a time. Sometimes, late at night, Claire still talks about that letter Tom left her, the one that gave her permission she didn't know she needed. She keeps it in a small box now, not hidden away in a closet gathering dust, but out where she can find it whenever she wants, a reminder that some of the people who love us the most know how to keep loving us even after they're gone, by wanting our happiness more than they want to be missed. And me, I still think sometimes about that first knock on my door, 1 in the morning, storm howling, a scared woman standing on my porch in a dead man's coat asking if she could just stay until it passed. I had no idea that night that I was answering the door to the rest of my life. I just knew a neighbor needed help, and I wasn't going to be the kind of man who left her standing out there in the rain. 9 months later, everything had changed. Looking back now, I think it started changing the second I stepped aside and said, come in. Have you ever had a moment like that, something small and ordinary that quietly became the biggest turn your whole life ever took? And do you think Tom would have approved of how it all played out? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.